You're listening to the Coach's Journey podcast, exposing the struggles and celebrating the successes in the life of coaches who are action takers and creating authentic impact in today's world. Whether you're just starting out, expanding your reach, or exploding your impact, you're in the right place right now. Stay tuned and be sure to subscribe to this podcast. Now, here are your hosts of the Coach's Journey podcast.
Then the question becomes, how can I help people understand that the pain they're experiencing, that they don't even realize they're experiencing because they don't know that there's another way? How can I help them have that perspective that there is another way? Which ties very much into the fear and anxiety right now. I'll bet there's a lot of people that are like, well, it is what it is. I'm just going to sit here in fear and feel paralyzed because I have no other option than to put my money in a bank. And now the banks aren't safe. At least that's what they feel. And so they just sit with that because they don't think there's another way. But there is another way. There's another way logically, but there's also another way to experience what's happening. They don't have to be so fearful, or they can experience it in a way that they can work through it rather than, kind of getting more entrenched in it. So these are ways that we can highlight what they're experiencing and then help them recognize that there is another way if they're open.
Yeah, I love that and completely agree. It's our underlying assumption when we're talking about this. And this is where you come in as a coach, that our underlying assumption is you know how to deal with your emotions, or you're at least working through it or trying to work through it. You don't need to be perfect at it, but if you don't know how to work through it, it'll be very difficult for you to jump in with a client. I've seen this in action where I've observed a session where there was a moment where this coach was going into it. And for me, it's like watching a movie, to be honest. Listen, it's more interesting than a movie.
Popcorn too. Do you like eat popcorn?
I'm like listening to this and I'm waiting for this coach to ask this very obvious, direct question. And when this person is sharing about their relationship, the coach completely derails the conversation, goes in a different direction. I'm like, go there. It was so direct. And I actually went back and I didn't want to assume something, even though I was like boiling up. So I go conversation. So I literally played that part. I'm like, so why didn't you go into this person's relationship when she was hurting in that moment? And this was his literal verbatim was that I didn't feel comfortable going into that.
Yeah, I was guessing you were going to say that person was like, I had no idea what to do with it, so I'm just going to go a different
direction. It would be the same exact thing. He was uncomfortable dealing with it. If you're uncomfortable with your own emotions, you're not going to be able to be comfortable to ask those direct questions, which would be a very simple question. It won't be like a complicated or a profound question. It's like, hey, it looks like you're hurting there. I wouldn't even label it. Like, it looks like you're hurting there, at least to me. I see a lot of emotions there. What's going on there? He completely bypassed and went towards a different direction. And I could tell the client was confused too, but she didn't know what to say because she's not the coach.
Yeah. Yeah. So in a parallel universe, as in therapy, one of the most fearful questions that a lot of times, especially newer therapists, don't ask is, so are you thinking about hurting yourself? Like, it's like they're introducing the idea to somebody. There's this weird thought and perspective that if I ask somebody, are you going to kill yourself? That all of a sudden, ooh, that's actually a really good idea.
Good idea. Let me put it on my list.
We're asking questions and we're trying to help people, it's helpful for us, I think. So this is an interesting thing that I heard you say years ago, Faisal, that has stuck with me. It's this interesting thing or balance, because I think what you said, and you're probably like, what did I say? You said something.
I don't know.
You said something to the effect of, I don't really have to know or understand what's going on with the client to still help them through it. That was like a mind blow for me, quite frankly, because up to that point, I felt like the only way I could help was if I fully understood. And so a lot of times I would end up spending a lot of time asking questions, trying to clarify, trying to understand the family constellation and who's all involved and stuff like that, which I think some of that's important. But so there's this dichotomy of like, how much do I go into detail on some of these questions versus how much don't I? But around emotions, I think if we if we don't help somebody kind of express and uncover what's there, it's left a mystery that is still highly impacting them. And just asking some of these questions, even though they might scare you. And as a coach, you're probably going to be in the position at times to ask that question. Like, are things so bad? Are you feeling so in despair that you're considering killing yourself? You're probably going to have to ask that at some point, or be in the position of making that choice of like, do I or don't I? But we're not introducing more fear. We're just allowing what is to come up. And I love the idea, or the question that we can ask ourselves is, are we uncomfortable with it? Because even if you're uncomfortable with it, you can still do it. You can still ask these questions and hang with them in the moment, in your discomfort and maybe their discomfort. But there's a lot of healing that can happen in that moment, even if you're uncomfortable. Like your comfort level really is irrelevant, in my opinion.
Well, I would say it's irrelevant, but also very relevant in the sense that I would go as far as, so here, like I'll give you a frame of reference. The coaching sessions that go very well for me, and like out of hundreds of coaching sessions, the coaching sessions that are like, my mind was blown open and the other person, and we're like at the end wondering like, what the hell? How did this come out of this conversation? I was just as uncomfortable as the client was. Yeah. And literally, and I know that when those moments happen, like I know that before I ask the question, my heart rate goes up. So my body responds to it faster than my thoughts even catch up. So I'm like, oh shit, I gotta ask the client, what do I need to, and I'm like, my thoughts are catching up. And that's part of the reason why Steve Chandler in his book, The Prosperous Coach, he says, and it took me a while to figure out what he meant by that. Like part of your attention always needs to be on your body. And we know that from like how body language works. Your body doesn't know how to lie. Your mind does. Your mind will tell you all kinds of things, all kinds of narratives and stories, and your clients' minds will do too. But your body will tell you the truth. If you are, and it sounds counterintuitive, he's like, well, shouldn't my attention be fully on my client? No. You need to be aware of yourself too in that moment.
Yeah.
So usually what ends up happening is in those moments when I need to ask a question, like subconsciously, I know what I need to do. And there's another expert on this who studies the neuroscience aspect of it. And he's like, your body is your subconscious mind. Your body will give you very quick responses compared to your thoughts by the time they catch up. And in my experience, it's very true. So I'm sitting there and I'm asking a bunch of questions that are going at it. And all of a sudden I notice a shift in physiology, a tonality difference, and it happens it's like split second. And one of the first things I notice before I ask a difficult question is my heart rate starts to shoot up. And then I become aware, I'm like, oh shit. It's like a cat sitting there and all of a sudden they hear a bird. And their ears start to go like this, like their eyes. That's what happens.
So I can totally imagine I'm sitting here having a session, and then all of a sudden with you, Faisal, and all of a sudden I hear this beep, beep, beep. What is that? Don't worry about it. It's just my heart rate monitor. It's telling me I need to really ask.
I know, somebody gets the whole monitor.
It's like my Apple Watch is going off because it detected a heart rate increase.
So that'd be interesting to see.
That would be fascinating.
Actually, I realized this, like when I was working through this a couple of years ago, Tony Robbins came up with I'm Not Your Guru, the documentary he put on Netflix. I really loved it. Like I just loved the coaching parts of it. And when he was going in the audience and just the stories that people shared. At the end, part of the interview was the guy who was creating the documentary. He's like, yes, Tony Robbins, like, aren't you concerned that you're going to tell somebody something that they're going to do and they're going to screw up something in their life and you would be held accountable or something like that? He actually gave a really profound answer from a coaching standpoint. I don't think most people picked up on that. He's like, if you pay really close attention, I'm actually not telling anybody what to do. Mm-hmm. He's actually pulling something out of them and he's checking in with them. Is that what you need to do? He's like, well, what's stopping you then? And it looks like at the end that he's telling them to do this thing, but they had already made the decisions quite a few seconds or a few minutes before then. He can tell that they've made the decision. They just can't move their body, and he just kind of gives them a nudge. And that is very powerful to kind of think from a coach's standpoint, because a lot of the times we get into these coaching sessions, like the different, because a lot of times coaches are thinking about like, what profound question that I can ask that will move people. I don't think there are any standard profound questions, because it depends how it lands. It depends what state the client is in. It depends on the context of the conversation, because you could ask that question will have the completely different effect at different times. But in that moment, if you're present enough with the client, if you notice the simple shifts, and I'll give an example the other day. So I was with a client. He's a relatively new client. I felt like he was going to leave the program as well. And he had done a couple of sessions. And the way he was describing it, because he was realizing he was creating narratives in his mind. He's like, every time I come into these calls, like, I feel like I'm making up stuff. It's like, I don't actually have any problems in my life. He literally put it this way. I don't actually. And so his perception was, and I could tell, that coaching is about fixing things. And partly because he had been in a lot of the group sessions so far and he had only done one-on-one. And then I realized that he was looking for another level because it wasn't about a challenge. And by the way, for coaches, this is important because we've had coaches in our community who will go in a coaching session. They would ask the coach, because they don't have like a specific process they're talking to me, like, what are you dealing with right now? Or what are you struggling with? And the coach will literally say, I'm not struggling with anything. And they don't know how to navigate that. So this was actually a very difficult session for me to navigate in the beginning, the first 10 minutes of it, because I was trying to understand what this client was going through. And his perception, I could tell, I would pick up, is that he thinks it's about fixing things. And for me, it's not that. It's actually about pushing them to create a bigger perspective in life, going deeper into their own potential, creating a bigger vision for what matters to them. And has nothing to do with fixing anything. And the fixing actually is a byproduct of that. Because Grant Cardone says this a lot, is like, when you 10x your stuff, you're not going to be worried about little problems in your life. You're going to deal with bigger problems.
Yeah.
Not quite like that, but, and so we went into a different side, like completely approached it differently. I threw away my framework and I went and asked him, like, okay, what do you tell me a little bit about your life? I went towards his perception more so than what we were going to talk about around his identity. And his perception was very interesting. And as he started describing it, he looked at life a certain way. He was like very neutral about life. He was very, well, I'm going to die anyway. He was very accomplished and high achiever. He takes care of himself, but he had this perception that when I die, nothing's going to matter anyway. Why should I try anything? He wasn't saying that per se, but I could tell that was the background of his thinking. As we went into it, I'm like, have you considered having a different approach? What if you looked, we talked about death, like the whole conversation was about death. Like, what if there's a different possibility around death? Not even towards his beliefs and stuff. Like, let's explore that. As we explored that more and more, and I gave him some perspective on that, and I got him to think about it. It jogged a very different side of him. I'm like, so based on that, what do you feel your bigger vision could look like? If you did adapt something like that, if you did adapt a perception around that like that, and all of a sudden he goes in a completely different way and his body language shifted and he goes into excitement, from being from neutral to excitement. Like, okay, so let's make it more tangible. What would that look like in terms of your lifestyle? Let's start with your personal life. He's like, you know what? I think that means I need to travel 4 times a year, not once a year. And he can do it, by the way. He hasn't done it. He has the resources, he has the time, and he's already thinking about when he's going to do it. It's not even a question of how he's going to do it. And then we talked about the business side of things. He's like, you know what? I feel like I'm holding myself back. I feel like I can lead a lot of people in this direction, but I haven't been doing that. All of a sudden, his whole idea of life completely shifts. Now he's going in a completely different direction. I could not have predicted that in that session. I had to derail the whole thing, but that requires me to like be very attentive to the person's perception. And I wasn't trying to give him a belief or anything like that. He was very neutral about his life. And I checked in with him, like, is that how you want to be? He's like, no, I like being excited. I like having fun. I like being passionate about life, but I wasn't getting that from him. So before I go more into that, the point is that I think there are multiple levels of coaching. And as you work with people more and more, it stops being about challenges or even trauma or past challenges. It becomes about expansion. And I'd say really good coaching is about expanding somebody, at least to this far in my experience.
Yes. As you were talking, this is a totally random thought, but as you were talking, what occurred to me is a shift in approach with a client, particularly who's caught up on the technicality of the stress and anxiety economically or financially or whatever. But, rather than problem solving that, shifting it to, do they want to move more into being the kind of person that is not as thrown off by these sorts of things? So it's shifting the problem solving rather it's shifting their own development. Because a lot of, as Faisal said, we both work with a lot of high performers. Not everybody does. A high performer is simply, by Brendan Burchard's definition, is somebody who exceeds their peers in their productivity and the amount of stuff that they do, and they do it over long term. So it's not just like a quick crash and burn sort of thing. But if you're working with somebody who's got some big goals, they're really going to have to learn how to manage stress and how to be the kind of person that can take on more and bigger problems. Because as Faisal said, when you 10x something, you're 10xing your problems too. Problems don't get easier and smaller as you grow and develop. They get bigger and more complex. And so helping somebody become internally the kind of person that can weather this sort of thing may be kind of a way of refocusing.
Yeah, I would say this is one of those situations and it connects to our topic, is how would you get people to deal with fear? Well, part of it is that, so if he's really panicked, so if a client comes in, they are like, I could tell physiologically they're not able to handle it. And the way it's easily shows up, a client comes in, they're speaking really fast, they're not breathing. You could tell in their body language, they're very like tense, especially if you're doing it video, but even audio, you can tell in the tonality that they're not like, and if you've listened to people enough, you know that that's not their normal state. It's an exception to their normal state. And I would just stop them, and I wouldn't even talk about stuff. If they're in that state, because it doesn't matter what you talk about, they need to deal with that state, and they haven't given themselves space. I will literally get them to close their eyes, work through that for a good 2 to 5 minutes. And then every time I've done this, like without exception, they will go to the other side. And the first thing that changes is their tonal shifts. Their tonality they speak much slower.
Yes.
They speak much slower. They feel much, and they will say, I'm calmer. It's like, I still have the stressors, but I'm much more calm. But now you're in a place where you can work through things. You can go towards plan. So the part of it is that you need to kind of help them with tools if they're not able to handle it, whether it's in that moment or if they're talking about their family or kids or team member, and they're like in complete rage mode. I would want them to deal with that part and take responsibility with that part first. And then the other side of the conversation, which is, I think, more coaching oriented. This is what I would say separates coaching from therapy very clearly, is that you get them in a very different state. Now we're not talking about right now. We're getting them a vision for a very different being that they could be. Yes. The possibility of something much greater. And they can see that in their mind, their ideal version, that better version of themselves. So if they can connect with that at an emotional and visual and at a linguistic level, they will take you with them there. The coaching part becomes easy because they want that. Most people want to live up to a better ideal for themselves. And everybody has a different, of course, it's subjective and it's contextual because everybody has a different version of what that looks like. So we can't judge what is big or small for somebody else. But to them, to their experience, when they can see the next level, they get excited about that. And ideally, that's what we want for our clients, is that's what we get paid for, to push them past their comfort area, push them past where they have convinced themselves to be, which we know that they are not. And by the way, that's a condition. As a coach, you need to believe that somebody's capable of more. If you don't, then you're not going to be able to coach them.
You're listening to the Coach's Journey podcast.